The morning sun cast long shadows across the grand courtyard of Buckingham Palace as Captain James Whitmore adjusted his ceremonial uniform one final time. After 23 years of faithful service to the crown, he had never imagined this day would come. His weathered hands trembled slightly as he straightened the golden braids on his shoulders, knowing that this might be the last time he would wear them with honor. James had dedicated his entire adult life to protecting the royal family. He joined the Queen's Guard at 19, fresh-faced and eager to serve his country. Over the decades, he had witnessed countless moments of history unfold within these palace walls. He had stood silent during state dinners, protected visiting dignitaries, and maintained his post through storms both literal and metaphorical. But nothing had prepared him for the moral crisis that now consumed his every waking moment. The source of his anguish lay locked away in a vault 3 floors below where he stood. The Queen's personal jewelry collection, accumulated over decades of her reign, represented more than mere precious stones and gold. Each piece told a story of the monarchy's history, of diplomatic gifts received, of traditions passed down through generations. The sapphire necklace gifted by the people of Sri Lanka, the diamond tiara worn at countless state occasions, the emerald brooch that had belonged to Queen Victoria herself, all of these treasures carried the weight of the crown's legacy. When Queen Elizabeth passed away peacefully in her sleep 18 months ago, the entire nation mourned. James had stood vigil during those solemn days, his heart heavy with genuine grief for the woman he had served and respected deeply. The Queen had always treated her guards with kindness and respect, remembering their names, asking about their families, and showing appreciation for their dedication. She was more than a monarch to James. She was a symbol of everything noble and enduring about their nation. The transition of power should have been seamless. King Charles, now the reigning monarch, had waited his entire life for this moment. Camilla, his queen consort, stepped into her new role with the grace expected of her position. At first, everything appeared to proceed according to royal protocol. The funeral was conducted with appropriate dignity. The coronation followed months later with magnificent pageantry, and life in the palace settled into its new rhythm. However, James began to notice subtle changes that troubled him deeply. Camilla had always shown interest in the royal jewelry collection, but her attention to these pieces seemed to intensify after becoming queen consort. She would spend hours in the vault, examining each item with an intensity that made James uncomfortable. Her personal secretary began making inquiries about the insurance values of specific pieces, claiming it was for updated security protocols. The first disappearance occurred 6 months after the coronation. James noticed during his routine security check that the Queen's favorite pearl necklace was missing from its designated case. When he brought this to Camilla's attention, she dismissed his concerns with a wave of her hand, claiming the piece was being cleaned and restored. Weeks passed, then months, but the necklace never returned to its proper place. More items began to vanish with increasing frequency. The diamond bracelet that had belonged to Princess Diana disappeared next, followed by several brooches of significant historical value. Each time James raised concerns, he received the same vague explanations about cleaning, restoration, or temporary relocation for security purposes. But his trained eye and decades of experience told him a different story. James conducted his own discreet investigation, using his security clearance to review access logs and surveillance footage. What he discovered shook him to his core. Several pieces of the missing jewelry had appeared at high-end auction houses in London and Paris. The sellers remained anonymous, but the descriptions matched the missing items perfectly. When he tried to dig deeper, he found that the auction records had been mysteriously sealed or had disappeared entirely. The weight of this knowledge pressed down on James like a physical burden. His loyalty to the crown ran deeper than blood, but his conscience demanded action. He had sworn an oath to protect the royal family and their possessions, but what happened when the threat came from within? The Queen's jewelry collection represented the heritage of the British people, artifacts that belonged in the crown's possession for future generations to cherish and preserve. Sleep became elusive as James wrestled with his options. He could report his suspicions to higher authorities, but who would believe a guard's word against the Queen consort? He could remain silent and hope the situation would resolve itself, but his integrity wouldn't allow such cowardice. The memory of Queen Elizabeth's trust in him haunted his nights, her gentle voice echoing in his mind as she had once told him that the crown's treasures were held in trust for the nation. His wife Margaret noticed the change in her husband's demeanor. For weeks she watched him pace their modest flat, his meals growing cold as he stared into space, lost in thought. When she finally confronted him about his distress, James found himself unable to share the full truth. The burden of his suspicions felt too heavy to place on her shoulders, and his oath of discretion prevented him from revealing palace secrets, even to his beloved wife of 30 years. The turning point came on a cold Tuesday morning when James discovered that the Queen's coronation necklace had vanished overnight. This wasn't just any piece of jewelry. It was an artifact of immense historical significance worn by queens for over 2 centuries. The thought of this irreplaceable treasure disappearing into private hands filled James with a rage he had never experienced during his years of service. That evening, James made his decision. He would confront Camilla directly, guard the Queen Consort, and demand the return of every stolen piece. His career would likely end in disgrace, his pension might be forfeited, and his reputation could be destroyed. But some principles were worth more than personal security. The memory of Queen Elizabeth, the honor of his uniform, and his duty to the crown demanded that he take this stand. As James prepared for what might be his final act as a royal guard, he felt a strange sense of peace settle over him. Tomorrow he would speak truth to power regardless of the consequences. The Queen's jewels would return to their rightful place, or he would die trying to make it happen. The next morning arrived with unusual tension hanging in the air of Buckingham Palace. James had barely slept, his mind racing through various scenarios of how his confrontation with Queen Consort Camilla might unfold. He dressed in his finest uniform, ensuring every button gleamed and every crease was perfect. If this was to be his last day as a royal guard, he would face it with the dignity his position demanded. James had requested a private audience with Camilla through her personal secretary, claiming it was a matter of urgent security concerning the crown jewels. The secretary, a stern woman named Mrs. Harrison, had initially been reluctant to grant such a meeting. Royal guards typically communicated through established chains of command, not directly with members of the royal family. However, James's reputation for unwavering loyalty in his decades of service had earned him enough respect that his request was eventually approved. As he walked through the familiar corridors toward Camilla's private study, James reflected on all the moments that had led to this confrontation. He remembered the day he first met Queen Elizabeth, how nervous he had been as a young recruit. She had smiled warmly and told him that protecting the crown meant protecting the history and heritage of their nation. Those words had guided him through every decision of his career, and they strengthened his resolve now. The door to Camilla's study was ornate, carved from dark oak and adorned with the royal coat of arms. James knocked 3 times as protocol demanded and waited for permission to enter. When Camilla's voice called out, he stepped inside and immediately noticed something that made his blood run cold. On her desk, displayed casually among papers and correspondence, lay Queen Elizabeth's personal diamond brooch, a piece he knew for certain had been reported missing from the vault. Camilla looked up from her writing, her expression neutral but with a hint of curiosity in her eyes. She was dressed elegantly in a navy blue suit, her hair perfectly styled, every inch the picture of royal composure. However, James detected something else in her manner, a subtle wariness that suggested she might already know the purpose of his visit. "Captain Whitmore," she said, setting down her fountain pen. "Mrs. Harrison mentioned you had urgent security concerns to discuss. Please take a seat." James remained standing, his training taking over as he assumed the formal posture required when addressing royalty. "Your Majesty, I must speak plainly about a matter that has been troubling me for several months. It concerns the security and location of certain items from Her late Majesty's personal jewelry collection." The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Camilla's expression didn't change dramatically, but James caught a fleeting flash of something, anger perhaps, or calculation, in her eyes before her royal mask slipped back into place. "I'm not sure I understand your concern, Captain," she replied smoothly. "The jewelry collection is secure and properly maintained. Are you suggesting there has been a security breach?" James took a deep breath, knowing that his next words would change everything. "Your Majesty, with the greatest respect, several pieces from the collection have been missing for months. The Queen's pearl necklace, Princess Diana's diamond bracelet, the sapphire earrings from the Indian collection, and as of yesterday, the coronation necklace. These items have not been returned to their designated locations despite repeated inquiries. Camilla stood slowly, her movements deliberate and controlled. She walked to the window overlooking the palace gardens, her back to James as she appeared to consider his words. The silence stretched between them like a taut wire, filled with unspoken accusations and mounting tension. "Captain Whitmore," she finally said, still facing the window, "you have served this family faithfully for many years. Your dedication has not gone unnoticed. However, I must remind you that the disposition of royal property is not within your purview. Items are moved for various reasons: restoration, insurance evaluation, security assessments. Surely you understand this." James felt his jaw clench at her dismissive tone. "Your Majesty, I have conducted security for this collection for over 2 decades. I am familiar with all standard procedures. What I have observed does not align with any protocols I know. Furthermore, I have reason to believe that some of these items may have been sold at private auctions." The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a fired gun. Camilla turned slowly to face him, and for the first time since he had entered the room, her composure cracked slightly. Her eyes narrowed, and when she spoke, her voice carried a dangerous edge. "Captain, you are making very serious allegations. I hope you have substantial evidence to support such claims, because if you do not, you are treading on very thin ice indeed." James had prepared for this moment. From his inner jacket pocket, he withdrew a manila folder containing photocopies of auction house catalogs, insurance documents, and his own detailed notes about the missing items. He placed it on her desk, next to the diamond brooch that shouldn't have been there. "Your Majesty, I have documentation showing that items matching the exact descriptions of missing pieces from the royal collection have appeared at Sotheby's and Christie's over the past 6 months. The timing corresponds precisely with their disappearance from the vault. I also have security footage showing unauthorized access to the jewelry storage area during hours when no official business was scheduled." Camilla's face flushed with anger as she glanced at the folder. She made no move to open it, but James could see her mind working quickly behind her eyes. When she looked up at him again, all pretense of royal dignity had been replaced by cold calculation. "Even if what you suggest were true," she said slowly, "what exactly do you think you can do about it? You are a guard, Captain Whitmore. Your job is to follow orders, not to investigate your betters or make wild accusations against the royal family." The threat in her words was unmistakable, but James had come too far to back down now. He thought of Queen Elizabeth's gentle smile, of his oath of service, of the heritage that was being slowly stripped away and sold to the highest bidder. "Your Majesty," he said, his voice steady despite the gravity of the moment, "I am making a formal request for the immediate return of all missing items to their proper locations. This is not a negotiation or a suggestion. The crown jewels belong to the people of Britain, held in trust by the monarchy. They are not personal property to be disposed of at will." Camilla's laugh was sharp and bitter. "A request? Captain, I think you forget your place. You serve at the pleasure of the crown, and that service can be terminated at any time." James straightened his shoulders, every inch of his bearing reflecting the pride and honor he had carried for 23 years. "Your Majesty, if that is your decision, I will accept it. But the missing jewelry must still be returned. This is bigger than my career or your convenience. This is about the integrity of the monarchy itself." The two stared at each other across the desk, the weight of history and duty hanging between them like a sword. James knew he had crossed a line from which there could be no return, but his conscience was finally clear. The confrontation in Camilla's study had reached a breaking point. The air crackled with tension as both James and the Queen Consort realized they had moved far beyond the boundaries of normal royal protocol. What happened next would determine not only James's fate, but potentially the future of the monarchy itself. Camilla moved away from her desk, pacing slowly around the room as she considered her options. James remained at attention, watching her carefully. He had studied human behavior for years as part of his security training, and he could see the wheels turning in her mind. She was calculating risks, weighing consequences, trying to find a way out of the trap that his evidence had created. "Captain Whitmore," she finally said, her voice taking on a different tone, softer, almost pleading. "You have served this family with distinction. Your loyalty has been exemplary. Surely we can find a way to resolve this misunderstanding without causing unnecessary drama. James recognized the shift in her approach. She was no longer the imperious queen consort issuing threats. Now she was a woman caught in a compromising position, trying to negotiate her way out, but his resolve remained firm. Your Majesty, this is not a misunderstanding. The evidence is clear. Several pieces of immense historical value have been removed from the royal collection and sold privately. This constitutes theft of national treasures regardless of who committed the acts. Camilla stopped pacing and faced him directly. For a moment her mask slipped completely, and James saw desperation in her eyes. You don't understand the pressures I face, she said quietly. The expenses of maintaining royal appearances, the constant scrutiny, the financial obligations that come with this position. Those pieces were just sitting in a vault collecting dust while real needs went unmet. The admission hung between them like a confession. James felt a mixture of vindication and sadness. Vindication because his suspicions had been confirmed, sadness because someone in such a privileged position would betray the trust placed in her. Your Majesty, James replied gently but firmly, those pieces don't belong to any individual. They are part of Britain's heritage held in trust for future generations. Queen Elizabeth understood this deeply. She would never have considered those treasures as personal assets to be liquidated. At the mention of the late Queen, Camilla's composure cracked further. Tears formed in her eyes, though whether from genuine remorse or fear of exposure, James couldn't determine. Elizabeth never had to worry about money, Camilla said bitterly. She inherited vast wealth and never questioned where her next meal would come from. I've had debts, obligations, people depending on me financially. When I saw those jewels just sitting there unused, it seemed like such a waste. James felt his anger rising at her casual dismissal of the late Queen's legacy. Your Majesty, Queen Elizabeth lived through rationing during the war, saw her country struggle through economic hardship, and never once considered the crown jewels as a personal bank account. Those pieces survived 2 world wars, economic depressions, and countless crises precisely because previous monarchs understood their sacred duty as guardians. The weight of his words seemed to hit Camilla like a physical blow. She sank into her chair, looking smaller and more vulnerable than James had ever seen her. But he couldn't allow sympathy to cloud his judgment. Too much was at stake. What do you want from me? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. James stepped forward, his military bearing unwavering. I want every stolen piece returned immediately. I want a complete accounting of what was sold and to whom. And I want your assurance that this will never happen again. Camilla looked up at him with a mixture of resentment and defeat. And if I refuse? What then, Captain? Will you run to the newspapers? 'Cause a scandal that could bring down the monarchy? The question revealed her fundamental misunderstanding of his character. James had spent his entire career protecting the royal family from scandal and disgrace. The last thing he wanted was to see the monarchy damaged, but he also understood that some principles were more important than temporary embarrassment. Your Majesty, I have no desire to harm the institution I've served my entire adult life, but I cannot stand by and watch it be corrupted from within. The monarchy's strength comes from its moral authority, from the trust of the British people. When that trust is betrayed, the institution itself is in greater danger than any scandal could create. Camilla was silent for several minutes, staring at her hands folded in her lap. James waited patiently, knowing that this was a moment that would define both their futures. Finally, she looked up at him with red-rimmed eyes. Some of the pieces have already been sold, she admitted quietly. The buyers were told they were replicas being sold for estate purposes. They have no idea they purchased authentic royal jewels. James felt his heart sink. While this was better than the pieces being lost forever, recovering them would be incredibly complicated. Which pieces, Your Majesty? And to whom were they sold? Camilla reached into her desk drawer and withdrew a small leather-bound notebook. With trembling hands, she opened it and began reading a list that made James's stomach turn. The Queen's favorite pearl necklace had been sold to a private collector in Monaco. Princess Diana's diamond bracelet had gone to an anonymous buyer through a Swiss auction house. 3 historically significant brooches had been purchased by a wealthy American businessman who collected royal memorabilia. The coronation necklace, James said when she finished reading. What about the coronation necklace that disappeared yesterday? Camilla's face flushed with shame. It's in my private safe upstairs. I was waiting for the right opportunity to find a buyer. Relief flooded through James. At least that irreplaceable piece of history was still recoverable, but the magnitude of what had been lost weighed heavily on his heart. Your Majesty, you must understand that this cannot continue. The remaining pieces must be returned immediately, and we must find a way to recover what has been sold. Camilla nodded slowly, the fight seeming to drain out of her. What you're asking for? It will require admitting what I've done. The scandal will be enormous. James considered this carefully. He had no desire to destroy the monarchy, but he also couldn't allow the theft to continue. Your Majesty, there may be a way to handle this discreetly. If the missing pieces are returned quietly, and the sold items are recovered through private channels, perhaps this can be resolved without public exposure. Hope flickered in Camilla's eyes. You would help me fix this? After what I've done? James met her gaze steadily. Your Majesty, my oath is to protect the crown, not to destroy it. If you are willing to make this right, completely and permanently, then perhaps we can find a path forward that serves both justice and the monarchy's interests. The conversation had taken an unexpected turn, but James realized that sometimes protecting the institution meant helping those within it find redemption rather than punishment. The atmosphere in Camilla's study had shifted dramatically from confrontational to collaborative, though the underlying tension remained thick. James understood that offering to help resolve the situation quietly was a calculated risk, but his primary loyalty was to the institution of the monarchy rather than to punishing any individual, even one who had betrayed their sacred trust. Camilla sat at her desk, her notebook open between them like evidence at a trial. The list of stolen and sold items seemed to grow longer as she remembered additional pieces that had been removed from the collection. James took careful notes, his military training helping him organize the information methodically despite his emotional turmoil. The emerald bracelet from the Indian collection, Camilla continued hesitantly, was sold 3 weeks ago to a collector in Dubai. He specializes in pieces with royal provenance and paid significantly above market value because he believed it had belonged to Queen Victoria. James winced at this revelation. The bracelet in question was indeed a Victoria-era piece, gifted to the crown by the Maharaja of Punjab in 1849. Its historical significance went far beyond its monetary value, representing a crucial period in British-Indian relations. The thought of such an artifact sitting in a private collection, perhaps never to be seen by the public again, filled him with profound sadness. Your Majesty, James said carefully, recovering these pieces will require resources and connections that neither of us possesses alone. We'll need help from people who understand the international art market and have the ability to negotiate discreet transactions. Camilla looked up hopefully. Do you know such people? James considered the question thoughtfully. During his years of service, he had worked with various experts who advised the royal family on security matters related to their art and jewelry collections. There were insurance investigators, art recovery specialists, and even former law enforcement officers who now worked in the private sector, helping wealthy clients recover stolen or lost valuables. I may know someone, James admitted. Sir Edmund Hartwell retired from Scotland Yard 5 years ago after heading their art and antiquities unit for 2 decades. He now works privately, helping collectors and institutions recover missing pieces. He's discreet, effective, and most importantly, he understands the sensitive nature of royal affairs. Relief flooded Camilla's face. Would he help us? And could we trust him to keep this confidential? James nodded slowly. Sir Edmund has worked with the royal family before on insurance matters and authentication issues. He signed confidentiality agreements years ago that are still in effect. But Your Majesty, his help will come at a price, both financially and in terms of full disclosure about what happened. The mention of cost seemed to strike a nerve with Camilla. Her financial pressures had apparently driven her to this desperate situation in the first place. How much might it cost to recover the pieces? Potentially millions, James replied honestly. When items like these appear on the black market or in private collections, recovering them often requires paying the current owners significantly more than they originally paid. Plus Sir Edmund's fees, legal costs, and other expenses. Camilla's face paled. I don't have that kind of money. The proceeds from the sales have already been spent on various debts and obligations. This revelation hit James like a physical blow. Not only had irreplaceable artifacts been stolen and sold, but the money was gone as well. Recovery would require funding from other sources, which complicated the situation enormously. Your Majesty, what exactly were these debts and obligations? Perhaps if we understand the underlying financial pressures, we can address those issues as well to prevent future problems. Camilla hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with such personal disclosure. But she seemed to realize that complete honesty was now her only option for redemption. My children from my first marriage have had financial difficulties. She began slowly. Tom needed help with his business ventures that weren't performing well. Laura had divorce expenses and custody issues that required expensive legal representation. I also have obligations to various charities and social causes that I've supported for years. When I became Queen Consort, people expected even more generous contributions. James listened without judgment, understanding now that Camilla's motivations, while inexcusable, came from a desire to help her family rather than pure greed. This didn't absolve her of responsibility, but it did provide context that might be useful in determining how to move forward. Your Majesty, the royal family has financial advisors and legal counsel who could have helped address these issues through legitimate means. Why didn't you seek their assistance? Camilla's expression grew defensive. You don't understand the scrutiny that comes with this position. Every expense is questioned. Every financial decision is reviewed. I couldn't have my children's private affairs examined by royal accountants and lawyers. The press would have had a field day if they learned about Tom's business problems or Laura's divorce. James recognized the impossible position she described. The royal family lived in a fishbowl where privacy was a luxury they could rarely afford. However, this didn't justify theft of national treasures. Your Majesty, we need to contact Sir Edmund immediately. The longer these pieces remain in private hands, the more difficult recovery becomes. Some collectors eventually donate their acquisitions to museums or sell them again, making the trail even more complex to follow. Camilla nodded reluctantly. What do I need to tell him? James thought carefully about how to present the situation. We'll need to provide him with complete documentation of what was taken, when it was sold, and to whom. He'll also need detailed photographs and historical provenance information for each piece to help identify them in the marketplace. And how do we explain how these items came to be sold in the first place? This was the crucial question. Sir Edmund would need to know the truth to do his job effectively, but spreading knowledge of the theft to additional people increased the risk of public exposure. We'll have to tell him the truth, Your Majesty. But Sir Edmund has handled sensitive cases before. He understands that sometimes protecting institutional reputation is as important as recovering stolen property. Camilla was quiet for several minutes, weighing her options. Finally, she looked up at James with an expression of resigned determination. Very well, Captain. Make contact with Sir Edmund. Tell him that certain pieces from the royal collection have been misplaced, and that we need his assistance in locating and recovering them discreetly. If he requires more detailed information, I'll provide it personally. James felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. They were taking the first concrete step toward resolving the crisis, but the path ahead remained treacherous and uncertain. The next few weeks would determine whether the missing treasures could be recovered, and whether the monarchy could emerge from this scandal with its reputation intact. Your Majesty, I'll contact Sir Edmund today. In the meantime, I need your assurance that no additional pieces will be removed from the collection. Camilla met his gaze directly. You have my word, Captain Whitmore. No more pieces will be touched. As James prepared to leave her study, he turned back one final time. Your Majesty, I hope you understand that this conversation changes nothing about my duty as a royal guard. If any similar situation arises in the future, I will not hesitate to take action. Camilla nodded solemnly. I understand completely, Captain. And despite everything, I'm grateful that someone with your integrity was watching over the collection. 3 days had passed since James's confrontation with Queen Consort Camilla, and the weight of their shared secret pressed heavily on his shoulders. He had made contact with Sir Edmund Hartwell, who had agreed to meet them that afternoon at a discreet location away from the palace. The art recovery specialist had asked few questions over the phone, but James could sense his curiosity and concern about the unusual circumstances. James had spent those 3 days conducting his own internal investigation, reviewing security footage more thoroughly and documenting everything he could about the missing pieces. What he discovered only deepened his concern about the scope of the problem. The thefts had been going on longer than he initially realized. with subtle removals dating back almost to the beginning of Camilla's tenure as queen consort. The meeting location Sir Edmund had chosen was a private room at the Athenaeum Club in London, a gentleman's club known for its discretion and its membership of distinguished professionals. James arrived first, wearing civilian clothes to avoid drawing attention. The club's atmosphere of old-world elegance and quiet sophistication seemed fitting for such a delicate conversation. Sir Edmund Hartwell appeared exactly as James remembered him from their brief interactions. Years earlier, a tall, distinguished man in his early 60s with silver hair and intelligent eyes that seemed to miss nothing. He carried himself with the confidence of someone who had spent decades solving complex cases and navigating sensitive situations. "Captain Whitmore," Sir Edmund said as they shook hands. "It's been some time since we last met. I must admit your call intrigued me considerably." Before James could respond, Queen Consort Camilla arrived, accompanied only by a single personal protection officer who remained outside the room. She looked tired and anxious, clearly struggling with the stress of the situation. James stood respectfully as she entered, and Sir Edmund bowed appropriately. "Your Majesty," Sir Edmund said smoothly, "it's an honor to meet you, though I confess I'm puzzled about the nature of this consultation." Camilla took a seat at the small table, her hands trembling slightly as she folded them in her lap. James could see that the past few days had taken their toll on her. The weight of her actions and their potential consequences was clearly overwhelming. "Sir Edmund," James began carefully, "we need your expertise in recovering certain pieces from the royal jewelry collection that have been displaced over recent months. The situation requires absolute discretion and the highest level of professionalism." Sir Edmund's expression grew more serious. In his years of art recovery work, he had learned to read between the lines of such carefully worded requests. "I see. Can you provide more specific details about these displaced items?" Camilla cleared her throat nervously. "Sir Edmund, before we proceed, I need your absolute assurance that everything discussed in this room will remain confidential, regardless of your decision to take the case on, Your Majesty. My professional reputation depends on discretion. Nothing you tell me will leave this room without your explicit permission." With Sir Edmund's assurance, Camilla began to tell her story. She spoke haltingly at first, but as the conversation progressed, the full scope of what had happened emerged. Sir Edmund listened without interruption, occasionally making notes in a small leather notebook. His expression remained neutral, but James could see the gravity of the situation registering in his eyes. When Camilla finished her confession, Sir Edmund was quiet for several minutes processing the information. Finally, he looked up at both of them with a serious expression. "Your Majesty, Captain Whitmore, I want to be absolutely clear about what you're asking me to do. We're not just talking about recovering stolen art. We're talking about retrieving artifacts that are part of Britain's national heritage, sold under false pretenses to unsuspecting buyers. This is an extraordinarily complex situation with potential legal, diplomatic, and political ramifications." James leaned forward. "Sir Edmund, what are our options? Is recovery even possible?" Sir Edmund consulted his notes before responding. "Recovery is possible in most cases, but it will be expensive, time-consuming, and complicated. Each piece will require a different approach depending on where it ended up and who currently possesses it." He turned to address Camilla directly. "Your Majesty, the buyers you described likely acted in good faith, believing they were purchasing legitimate items with proper provenance. Convincing them to return these pieces will require either proving they were obtained illegally, which could expose your role, or offering them substantial compensation for their voluntary return." Camilla's face grew pale. "How substantial?" "Potentially 2 to 3 times what they originally paid, plus their expenses and inconvenience. Collectors who specialize in royal items tend to be wealthy individuals who won't part with their acquisitions easily." James felt his stomach drop. The financial implications were staggering. What about legal action? Couldn't the royal family simply demand return of their stolen property? Sir Edmund shook his head. Legal action would require filing police reports, court proceedings, and public documentation. Everything would become part of the public record. The scandal would be enormous and would likely damage the monarchy irreparably. The three sat in heavy silence as the implications sank in. They were trapped between the need to recover invaluable national treasures and the requirement to keep the theft secret to protect the institution of the Monarchy. There is another option, Sir Edmund said slowly. It's unorthodox and carries its own risks, but it might be our best chance for discreet recovery. Both. James and Camilla looked at him expectantly. We could create a cover story that certain pieces were discovered to be forgeries that had somehow replaced the originals years ago. This would give us legal grounds to approach current owners and request return of what we could claim are stolen goods, while providing them with an explanation that doesn't implicate your majesty. James considered this carefully. Would such a story be believable? Authentication of royal jewels has always been somewhat informal, Sir Edmund explained. Many pieces have been copied over the years for security purposes or public display. It wouldn't be unprecedented for someone to discover that items thought to be originals were actually replicas. Camilla looked hopeful for the first time in days. Would this approach work for all the missing pieces? Potentially, but we'd need to move quickly before any of the buyers decide to have their purchases independently authenticated. Once an item is verified as genuine by multiple experts, claiming it's a forgery becomes much more difficult. Sir Edmund opened his briefcase and withdrew several manila folders. I've already begun preliminary research based on the information Captain Whitmore provided. The good news is that most of the buyers appear to be private collectors rather than museums or institutions. Private collectors are generally more willing to cooperate quietly to avoid publicity. He spread photographs and documents across the table. The pearl necklace sold to the collector in Monaco presents our best opportunity. He's known for buying and selling pieces regularly, so he might be willing to accept a reasonable offer for its return. The diamond bracelet in Switzerland is more problematic. That buyer specifically sought out Diana-related items and probably won't part with it easily. James studied the documents carefully. What about the pieces sold to the American businessman? Interesting case, Sir Edmund replied. He's a technology entrepreneur who collects royal memorabilia as a hobby. He's also known for his philanthropic work and might be sympathetic to returning items to their rightful place if approached correctly. Camilla had been listening intently to every word. Sir Edmund, if we pursue this forgery angle, what are the risks? The primary risk is that someone with expertise in royal jewelry might question the authenticity of our claims. We'd need to be very careful about which pieces we claim are forgeries and have plausible explanations for how the switch might have occurred. Sir Edmund leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. There's also the matter of my fee and expenses. A recovery operation of this magnitude will require travel, research, negotiations, and potentially significant payments to current owners. We're looking at costs in the millions of pounds. The financial reality hit the room like a cold wave. James watched Camilla's face crumble as she realized the enormity of what recovery would require. I don't have access to those kinds of funds, she said quietly. The money from the sales is already gone. And I can't access royal accounts for this purpose without explanations I can't provide. James had been thinking about this problem since their first meeting. Your Majesty, perhaps there's another way. The royal family has insurance policies on the jewelry collection. If we report the items as missing or damaged, the insurance payouts could fund the recovery efforts. Sir Edmund nodded approvingly. That's actually quite clever. Insurance fraud would be a concern, but if the items are ultimately returned to the collection, the insurance companies might be willing to overlook the technicalities. But wouldn't filing insurance claims create records that could be discovered later? Camilla asked nervously. Not necessarily, Sir Edmund replied. Insurance companies handle sensitive claims for wealthy individuals all the time. They're accustomed to maintaining confidentiality when necessary. James felt a spark of hope for the first time since this crisis began. So our plan would be to file insurance claims for missing items, use the payouts to fund recovery efforts, and then quietly return the pieces to the collection? Essentially, yes, Sir Edmund confirmed. Though we'd need to be very careful about the timing and documentation. Everything would need to appear completely legitimate to outside observers. Camilla looked between the two men with a mixture of hope and fear. How long would such an operation take? Several months, possibly longer, Sir Edmund admitted. Each piece will require individual attention, and we can't appear too eager or desperate in our negotiations. Patience will be crucial. James realized they were committing to an elaborate deception that would require sustained effort and careful coordination. The risks were enormous, but the alternative, permanent loss of irreplaceable national treasures, was unacceptable. Sir Edmund, James said formally, If Queen Consort Camilla agrees to proceed, can we count on your assistance? Sir Edmund gathered his papers methodically before responding. Captain Whitmore, Your Majesty. I've spent my career recovering stolen art and returning it to its rightful owners. These pieces belong to the British people, held in trust by the Crown. Despite the unusual circumstances that led to their disappearance, I believe recovery is not just possible but morally necessary. He turned to Camilla with a serious expression. Your Majesty, I'll help you recover these pieces, but I need your absolute commitment that nothing like this will ever happen again. The monarchy's credibility depends on the public's trust, and that trust, once broken, is nearly impossible to rebuild. Camilla met his gaze steadily. Sir Edmund, you have my solemn word. This was a terrible mistake born of desperation, but it will never be repeated. As the meeting concluded, James felt both relief and apprehension about the path they had chosen. They were embarking on a complex operation that could either save the monarchy from scandal, or if discovered, destroy it completely. 6 weeks had passed since the meeting at the Athenaeum Club, and the recovery operation was well underway. James found himself living a double life, maintaining his regular duties as a royal guard while secretly coordinating one of the most delicate art recovery missions in British history. The stress was taking its toll, but the progress they were making kept him motivated. Sir Edmund had proven to be as skilled and discreet as his reputation suggested. He had established contact with all the buyers and was gradually building relationships that would facilitate the eventual recovery negotiations. His cover story about authentication concerns had been accepted without suspicion, and several buyers had even expressed willingness to cooperate with verification processes. The insurance claims had been filed and processed with surprising efficiency. James had worked with Camilla to document the discovery of missing items during routine inventory checks. The insurance company, which had covered the royal collection for decades, handled the claims professionally and discreetly. The payouts provided the financial resources needed for the recovery operation. The first success came with the emerald bracelet that had been sold to the collector in Dubai. Sir Edmund had approached him as a representative of the Royal Collection Trust, explaining that recent research had raised questions about several pieces that might have been replaced with forgeries years earlier. The collector, who prided himself on owning only authentic pieces, immediately agreed to return the bracelet in exchange for a full refund, plus compensation for his inconvenience. James would never forget the moment when Sir Edmund delivered the bracelet back to the palace. Holding the ancient piece in his hands, seeing the intricate craftsmanship that had survived for over a century, he felt a profound sense of restoration. One piece of Britain's heritage had been saved. However, not all the negotiations were proceeding as smoothly. The American businessman who had purchased 3 of the missing brooches was proving more difficult to convince. He had commissioned his own authentication study and was beginning to ask uncomfortable questions about why items, supposedly discovered to be forgeries, had been sold with authentic royal provenance documentation. James received an urgent call from Sir Edmund requesting an immediate meeting. They met at a small cafe near Westminster, choosing a corner table where they could speak privately without being overheard. We have a problem, Sir Edmund said without preamble. The American collector Harrison Mitchell is not satisfied with our explanation. He's hired an independent expert who specializes in Victorian jewelry, and they're conducting a thorough analysis of the pieces he purchased. James felt his stomach drop. What kind of analysis? Everything. Metallurgy, gem authentication, historical wear patterns, construction techniques. If these pieces are confirmed as authentic, our entire cover story collapses. The implications were staggering. If Mitchell's expert confirmed the authenticity of the brooches, he would know that the Royal Collection Trust's claims about forgeries were false. From there, it would be a short leap to realizing that the pieces had been stolen from the Royal Collection. How long do we have? James asked. Mitchell's expert expects to complete the analysis within 2 weeks. After that, if our story doesn't hold up, Mitchell has indicated he might contact the authorities. James realized they were facing a crisis that could expose everything. What are our options? Sir Edmund had clearly been thinking about this problem extensively. We have 3 choices, none of them ideal. First, we could come clean to Mitchell and hope his discretion and patriotism motivate him to return the pieces quietly. Second, we could abandon recovery of his items and hope he never discovers the truth about their origin. Third, We could escalate our efforts to convince him before his expert completes the analysis. What would escalation involve? Direct intervention from someone with enough authority and credibility to override his suspicions. Someone he would trust and respect enough to accept their assurances without further questions. James understood immediately what Sir Edmund was suggesting. You're talking about involving King Charles. It might be our only option. If the king himself contacted Mitchell and requested the return of the pieces as a personal favor, explaining that they were removed from the collection due to a family misunderstanding, Mitchell might be willing to cooperate without demanding further explanations. The thought of involving King Charles in their deception filled James with dread. They had worked so hard to keep the theft secret and protect the monarchy from scandal. Bringing the king into their conspiracy would expand the circle of knowledge and increase the risks exponentially. Has Queen Consort Camilla been informed about this development? Sir Edmund nodded grimly. I briefed her yesterday. She's terrified about the possibility of exposure, but she agrees that involving the king might be necessary. James stared out the cafe window, watching ordinary people go about their daily lives, unaware that the stability of their monarchy hung in the balance. What exactly would we tell His Majesty? A modified version of the truth. We would explain that certain pieces were removed from the collection due to a family financial emergency, that they were sold privately with the intention of eventual recovery, and that one buyer is now proving difficult to work with. We would emphasize that this was an internal family matter that shouldn't become public. And you think the king would go along with this explanation? Sir Edmund considered the question carefully. King Charles has spent his entire life protecting the monarchy's reputation. If he understands that exposure would create a major scandal, he might be willing to help resolve the situation quietly, even if he doesn't approve of what happened. James felt the weight of the decision pressing down on him. Everything they had worked for over the past 6 weeks could succeed or fail based on this choice. When would we need to make this approach? Soon. Mitchell's expert is working quickly, and once that authentication is complete, our window for intervention closes. James made his decision. I'll speak with Queen Consort Camilla today. If she agrees, we'll request an audience with His Majesty. As James prepared to leave the cafe, Sir Edmund caught his arm. Captain, I want you to know that regardless of how this situation resolves, you've acted with honor throughout this crisis. Your loyalty to the crown and your integrity under pressure have been exemplary. The compliment meant more to James than Sir Edmund could know. For weeks he had wrestled with doubts about whether he was doing the right thing. Hearing those words from a man he respected helped reinforce his conviction that protecting the monarchy sometimes required difficult choices. Later that afternoon, James met with Camilla in her private study. She looked exhausted and older than when this crisis had begun, the stress clearly taking its toll on her health and appearance. Your Majesty, James began gently, Sir Edmund has briefed you on Mr. Mitchell's investigation. We need to discuss involving His Majesty in our recovery efforts. Camilla closed her eyes and took a deep breath. Captain, the thought of telling Charles what I've done fills me with dread. He trusted me to honor the traditions and responsibilities of my position, and I've betrayed that trust completely. James felt sympathy for her anguish, but the practical realities of their situation demanded action. Your Majesty, His Majesty's involvement might be our only chance to recover those final pieces without public exposure. The alternative could be a scandal that damages the entire royal family. Camilla opened her eyes and looked at James with a mixture of gratitude and resignation. You're right, of course. Will you help me prepare for that conversation? James nodded solemnly. Yes, Your Majesty. We'll face this together. The private audience with King Charles was scheduled for the following evening in his personal study at Clarence House. James had never been more nervous in his 23 years of royal service. He had faced armed intruders, terrorist threats, and countless security challenges. But nothing had prepared him for the conversation that lay ahead. Camilla had spent the day rehearsing what she would say to her husband, while James worked with Sir Edmund to prepare supporting documentation that would help explain the situation without revealing its full scope. They had agreed to present the theft as a temporary family financial crisis that had led to poor judgment rather than systematic looting of the royal collection. King Charles received them in his study with his characteristic dignity and warmth, though James could see concern in his eyes. The king was clearly puzzled about why his wife had requested such an unusual meeting with Captain Whitmore present. "Camilla James," the king said as they entered. "Please, sit down. I understand you have something important to discuss." Camilla looked pale and nervous as she took her seat. James remained standing at attention until the king gestured for him to sit as well. The informality of the setting did nothing to ease the tension in the room. "Charles," Camilla began, her voice barely steady, "I need to tell you about something I've done, something that I deeply regret and that requires your help to resolve." The king's expression grew more serious as he sensed the gravity of what was coming. "What is it, my dear?" With James providing occasional clarification and Sir Edmund's carefully prepared documentation as support, Camilla told her husband about the financial pressures that had led her to remove items from the royal jewelry collection. She explained about her children's needs, the mounting debts, and her desperation to help her family without creating public scrutiny. King Charles listened in complete silence, his face showing a mixture of shock, disappointment, and concern. When Camilla finished her confession, the room remained quiet for several long minutes as he processed what he had heard. "Camilla," he finally said, his voice heavy with emotion, "how could you not come to me with these problems? We could have found solutions that didn't involve this." Tears flowed down Camilla's face as she replied, "I was ashamed, Charles. I didn't want you to think less of me or my children. I thought I could handle it quietly and replace the pieces before anyone noticed." James spoke up carefully. "Your Majesty, Queen Consort Camilla contacted me when she realized the situation had gotten out of hand. She's been fully cooperative in our efforts to recover the missing pieces. Most have already been returned successfully." The king turned to James with a penetrating gaze. "Captain Whitmore, how long have you known about this situation?" "Several weeks, Your Majesty. I discovered the thefts during routine security checks and confronted Her Majesty immediately. Since then, we've been working with Sir Edmund Hartwell to recover the pieces discreetly." King Charles was quiet again, clearly struggling with the implications of what he'd learned. As the monarch, he had devoted his life to upholding the dignity and integrity of the crown. This betrayal of trust struck at the very heart of what he represented. "How many pieces are still missing?" he asked. "3 brooches, Your Majesty," Sir Edmund replied. "They're in the possession of an American collector who is beginning to ask difficult questions about their authenticity. We need your help to convince him to return them before he discovers the truth about their origin." The king stood and walked to his window, looking out at the London streets where his subjects went about their evening routines, unaware of the crisis unfolding in the royal household. "If this becomes public," he said quietly, "the damage to the monarchy could be irreparable. People trust us to be guardians of their heritage, not to sell it for personal gain." James felt compelled to defend the recovery efforts they had undertaken. "Your Majesty, that's exactly why we've worked so hard to resolve this quietly. The alternative, permanent loss of irreplaceable artifacts and public scandal, would serve no one's interests." King Charles turned back to face them. "What exactly do you need from me?" Sir Edmund stepped forward with his proposal. "Your Majesty, if you could contact Mr. Mitchell personally and request the return of the pieces as a family matter, explaining that they were removed due to a private misunderstanding, he might be willing to cooperate without demanding further explanation. You're asking me to lie to cover up theft." The blunt statement hung in the air like an accusation. James felt the moral complexity of their situation more acutely than ever. They were indeed asking the king to participate in deception, even if it was to protect the monarchy from scandal. "Your Majesty," James said carefully, "sometimes protecting the institution requires difficult choices. Your involvement would ensure that these pieces return to their rightful place in the crown's collection, where they belong." King Charles looked at his wife, who sat with her head bowed in shame and anguish. Despite his disappointment and anger, James could see the love and concern in his eyes. The king understood that his wife's fate and the monarchy's reputation were now inextricably linked. "What would I tell this collector?" Sir Edmund had prepared for this question. Simply that certain pieces were removed from the collection due to a family financial matter, that this was done without proper authorization, and that you're personally requesting their return to avoid any misunderstanding. You could offer to compensate him for his purchase and any inconvenience. The king considered this approach for several minutes before responding. "And you believe this will work?" "Mr. Mitchell is a successful businessman who understands the value of discretion," Sir Edmund replied. "A personal request from the King of England, combined with fair compensation, should be sufficient to secure his cooperation." King Charles returned to his seat and looked directly at each person in the room. "If I do this, I need absolute assurances that nothing like this will ever happen again. The crown's treasures are held in trust for the nation, not for personal financial convenience." Camilla looked up at her husband with tears in her eyes. "Charles, you have my solemn word. I will never betray your trust or the crown's responsibilities again." The king nodded slowly. "Very well. Sir Edmund, arrange the contact with Mr. Mitchell. I'll make the call personally and request the return of those pieces." Relief flooded through James as he realized they had cleared the final hurdle. With the king's involvement, the recovery operation could be completed successfully. 3 days later, King Charles made the call to Harrison Mitchell. The conversation lasted less than 10 minutes, with the king explaining the situation as a private family matter that needed discreet resolution. Mitchell, clearly honored to receive a personal call from the British monarch, agreed immediately to return the brooches in exchange for compensation and a signed photograph from the king. 2 weeks after that call, Sir Edmund delivered the final 3 pieces to James at Buckingham Palace. As James placed each brooch back in its designated location within the royal collection, he felt a profound sense of completion. Every stolen item had been recovered and returned to its rightful place. The total cost of the recovery operation had been substantial, nearly £4 million in payments to buyers, Sir Edmund's fees and associated expenses. But considering the irreplaceable historical value of the recovered pieces and the scandal that had been avoided, James considered it money well spent. Camilla had kept her word about financial reform, working with royal advisors to establish proper support systems for her family, while maintaining appropriate boundaries between personal and royal resources. The experience had been traumatic for everyone involved, but it had also created a new understanding of the responsibilities and vulnerabilities that came with their positions. James continued his duties as a royal guard with renewed appreciation for the weight of his oath to protect the crown. The crisis had tested his principles and his loyalty in ways he had never imagined, but he felt confident that he had honored both the institution he served and his own moral convictions. The Queen's jewels remained safe in their vault, protected once again by the dedication of those who understood their true value as symbols of Britain's heritage and the enduring strength of its monarchy. The secret of what had happened would remain closely guarded, but the lessons learned would influence the royal household for generations to come.